The year is 1780. America's fight for freedom is hanging on by a tiny thread. British soldiers are crushing the southern states. Militias who support the British are burning the homes of patriots. And one frontier farmer is about to change everything. His name is Isaac Shelby, and in just 3 months, he'll lead one of the most important battles in American history. But this isn't just a story about one battle. It's about how a boy from the wildest edges of civilization became the builder of American victory, created a state from nothing, and came back to war as an old man to save his country one last time. This is the story of how a backwards leader became a legend that people would remember for centuries. Welcome to History USA. The American Revolution wasn't won by generals in fancy wigs, sitting in comfortable offices. It was won by farmers, frontiersmen, and families who risked everything for freedom. Isaac Shelby was one of these men, but he was more than just another soldier, born into a world of constant danger on the colonial frontier. He grew up learning to survive in hostile wilderness, to lead men when things seemed impossible, and to fight when running away seemed like the only choice. But what made Shelby different wasn't just his bravery or his smart battle plans. It was his ability to make others totally loyal to him, his genius for understanding both land and human nature, and his strong commitment to a cause bigger than himself. Today, we're diving deep into his amazing life from his frontier childhood, where just surviving was an achievement, through his legendary military campaigns that changed the course of American history, from the blood-soaked slopes of Kings Mountain, where he became immortal, to the governor's mansion in Kentucky, where he built a commonwealth, and finally to his return to battle at age 62 when his nation called again. This is more than just a biography. It's the story of American toughness, frontier democracy, and what it truly means to be a citizen leader. By the time we're finished, you'll understand why this man's name is scattered across the American map, why his example still matters today, and how one person's choices can literally change the destiny of millions. Isaac Shelby was born on December 11th, 1750, in a place that no longer exists the way it did then. His birthplace was in the frontier region of Maryland, near what would become Hagerstown, in a territory that was still wild, still dangerous, and still fought over by various Native American tribes who had lived there for centuries. His parents, Evan Shelby and Letitia Cox Shelby, were not wealthy aristocrats or established landowners with inherited fortunes and social connections. They were frontier people, tough and resourceful, the kind of settlers who carved civilization out of wilderness with nothing but determination, hard work, and an almost unbelievable level of courage. The world they lived in was so different from our modern experience that it requires a lot of imagination to truly understand what their daily lives were like. Evan Shelby, Isaac's father, was himself a fascinating person whose story deserves attention. He was a Welsh immigrant who had arrived in America looking for opportunity and found it in the most challenging environments imaginable. Evan became a successful military officer and frontiersman, fighting in various conflicts, including the French and Indian War, where European powers and their colonial subjects battled for control of the North American continent. He understood wilderness warfare in ways that European-trained officers never could. He learned Native American tactics, studied how to move through dense forests silently, understood how to read tracks and signs that most people would never notice, and knew how to survive in environments where European military traditions meant absolutely nothing. These hard-won lessons would prove very valuable to his son, creating a legacy of military knowledge that would be passed from father to son and eventually used with devastating effect against British forces. Young Isaac grew up in a world that most modern people cannot truly understand, even with a lot of effort. The frontier wasn't just rural or undeveloped in the way we might think of remote areas today. It was genuinely constantly dangerous in ways that went far beyond anything most Americans today will ever experience. Families lived knowing that conflict could erupt at any moment without warning. Native American raids were a real and present threat, not because of any natural savagery on the part of indigenous peoples, but because these were contested lands where different peoples with incompatible visions for the future competed for resources, territory, and survival itself. The Shelby household, like all frontier families, had to be prepared for anything at any time. Isaac learned to shoot a rifle accurately before he learned to write with any real skill. He learned to track animals through dense forest, to read subtle signs in disturbed leaves or bent grass, to understand animal behavior and predict their movements. He learned to ride horses across difficult terrain, to navigate by stars and natural landmarks when no roads or maps existed, to judge distances and understand land features instinctively. These weren't hobby skills or interesting pastimes. They were survival necessities, the difference between life and death for families living on the absolute edge of colonial civilization. But Isaac's education wasn't purely military or focused only on wilderness survival. His parents, despite the enormous demands of frontier life, made sure he received some formal schooling, though it was necessarily limited by the standards of more established colonial areas. He learned to read and write, studied basic math that would prove valuable in surveying work later, and perhaps most importantly, absorbed the political philosophy that was beginning to develop throughout the American colonies in the years leading up to revolution. Even on the frontier, hundreds of miles from colonial capitals and centers of power, ideas about natural rights, representative government, and liberty were spreading through communities. The Shelby household discussed these concepts around their dinner table during evening meals, making young Isaac aware that the world was changing fundamentally, and that his generation might well be called upon to defend these emerging ideals with their lives. This combination of practical frontier skills and intellectual engagement with revolutionary political ideas would make Isaac uniquely qualified for the challenges that lay ahead. As Isaac entered his teenage years, the Shelby family made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. They moved even further into the frontier, relocating to the Holston River area in what is now eastern Tennessee, a region so remote that it was barely governed by any colonial authority whatsoever. This was Watauga country, named after the Watauga Association, one of the first attempts at democratic self-government west of the Appalachian Mountains, and a remarkable experiment in frontier democracy. The settlers here couldn't rely on coastal colonial governments for protection, justice, or any of the normal functions of civil authority. They formed their own agreements based on majority vote, elected their own leaders from among their peers, defended their own communities with locally organized militia forces, and created systems of law and order from scratch. This experience of genuine frontier democracy, where government authority came directly from the consent of the governed rather than from distant monarchs or appointed colonial officials, would shape Isaac's political philosophy for his entire life. He learned that effective government required the trust and participation of ordinary people, that leadership had to be earned rather than inherited, and that communities could govern themselves successfully if given the freedom to do so. In this environment, Isaac Shelby matured into a formidable young man, both physically and in terms of character. Physically, he was genuinely imposing, standing well over 6 feet tall at a time when the average man was considerably shorter, often by several inches. He had the build of someone who worked physically every single day, broad-shouldered and powerfully strong, with the kind of endurance that came from constant activity in demanding conditions. But his real strength, the quality that would ultimately make him a significant historical figure, was in his character and personality. Those who knew him, whose observations were recorded in letters and diaries of the period, consistently remarked on his unusual calmness under pressure, his fairness in resolving disputes between settlers, and his natural ability to lead others without seeming to seek authority aggressively. When young men gathered to organize hunting parties or scouting expeditions into potentially dangerous territory, Isaac often emerged as the organizer and decision-maker, not through self-promotion or aggressive pursuit of leadership positions, but simply because people instinctively trusted his judgment. He didn't seek authority for its own sake or for personal glory. People simply recognized in him qualities of reliability, sound judgment, and genuine concern for the welfare of the group that made them want to follow his leadership. By his early 20s, Isaac had become heavily involved in surveying work, following somewhat in his father's professional footsteps. Surveying was one of the most important and simultaneously most dangerous jobs on the frontier during this period. Surveyors mapped new territories that had never been accurately charted before, established property boundaries for settlers claiming land, and essentially opened lands for organized settlement by creating the legal and geographic framework that made property ownership possible. This work took Giza deep into wilderness areas, sometimes traveling through regions claimed by Native American nations, who were understandably hostile to surveyors whose work directly helped the takeover of their ancestral lands. The work required not just technical skill with specialized surveying instruments and mathematical calculations, but also diplomatic ability to negotiate with various parties claiming the same land, physical endurance to travel 4 weeks through difficult terrain, and constant watchfulness against numerous threats. Isaac excelled at all of these requirements, gaining a reputation for accuracy, fairness, and reliability that made his services highly sought after. During these extensive surveying expeditions, Isaac traveled throughout what would eventually become Kentucky and Tennessee, covering thousands of miles on foot and horseback over several years. He saw firsthand the incredible richness of these lands, the dark, fertile soil that could grow almost anything, the abundant game animals that could feed settlements, the clear rivers that provided water and transportation. He also saw, with perfect clarity, how desperately various parties wanted to control these territories for their own purposes. The British government had officially announced through the Royal Proclamation of 1763 that settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains was forbidden, attempting to prevent conflicts with Native American nations by creating a boundary beyond which colonial settlement could not expand. But frontier settlers largely ignored these announcements, viewing them as illegitimate attempts by distant authorities to control their lives and limit their opportunities. They believed they had a natural right to settle wherever they could survive and build communities, and they deeply resented distant authorities in London telling them otherwise. This fundamental tension between frontier independence and governmental control, between local self-determination and centralized authority, was building steadily toward an inevitable explosion that would reshape the continent. That explosion came in April 1775, when the American Revolution began with armed clashes at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. But for Isaac Shelby and the frontier settlers living hundreds of miles west of these events, the revolution wasn't primarily about tea taxes, stamp acts, or representation in Parliament. Those were Eastern concerns, matters that affected merchants and urban populations, but seemed remote to people living on the absolute edge of civilization. On the frontier, the revolution was about something more fundamental and immediate: whether frontier people would govern themselves according to their own needs and values, or be governed by distant authorities who didn't understand their lives, didn't face their challenges, and didn't share their priorities. The British Crown and its officials represented centralized authority, foreign control over local affairs, and increasingly heavy restrictions on westward expansion. The Patriot cause represented self-determination, local control of governmental decisions, and the exciting possibility of building an entirely new kind of society based on democratic principles, rather than inherited privilege and royal authority. Isaac's entry into military service came naturally and almost inevitably given his background and circumstances. When the revolution began in earnest, His father, Evan, was appointed as a colonel in the Virginia militia, and Isaac quickly joined the Patriot forces as an officer. His first significant military experience came in 1776 when he served in Virginia militia expeditions, participating in campaigns that most people today have never heard of. These weren't glorious battles against British regular troops that get commemorated in paintings and monuments. They were difficult, often thankless campaigns, dealing with the complex frontier conflicts that had become tangled with the larger revolutionary struggle. Various Native American nations, recognizing an opportunity to resist American expansion on their lands and seeing the British as potential allies who might help preserve indigenous control of territory, allied themselves with the Crown. This meant that frontier militia forces were constantly engaged in small, but deadly conflicts that combined elements of conventional warfare, guerrilla tactics, and what we might today call counterinsurgency operations. Isaac served as a lieutenant in several of these campaigns, learning military leadership through direct, often harsh experience rather than formal training at military academies. He participated in expeditions that built frontier forts to protect settlements, escorted groups of settlers to new locations through dangerous territory, and responded to raids that had devastated Patriot communities. This was guerrilla warfare at its most basic and brutal level. There were no grand strategies carefully planned in comfortable headquarters. No, formal battle lines were gentlemanly rules of warfare applied. No supply trains regularly bringing food, ammunition, and equipment to soldiers in the field. You carried what you could on your back or pack animals. You fought when circumstances demanded it. You made do with whatever resources you could scrounge or capture. And you survived by being smarter, tougher, and more adaptable than your opponents. Isaac absorbed these lessons thoroughly, developing an instinctive understanding of irregular warfare that would prove decisive in future campaigns. By 1779, Isaac had risen through militia ranks to become a captain, demonstrating leadership abilities that his superiors recognized and rewarded. He was given command over significant militia forces in the Sullivan County area of North Carolina, a region that pushed even further into frontier territory. This area was so remote that settlers had essentially created their own governmental structures because official colonial authority barely reached them and couldn't effectively address their needs. As a militia captain, Isaac's responsibilities extended far beyond simple military command. He was responsible for defending scattered settlements against various threats, but he also played a role in maintaining civil order, resolving disputes between settlers, and representing his community's interests in the few dealings they had with more established governmental authorities. He was becoming a complete frontier leader, someone who could fight when necessary, govern when required, and unite diverse, independent-minded people toward common purposes and shared goals. Then came 1780, and everything changed in ways that few people expected. This was truly the darkest, most desperate year of the American Revolution, when the entire Patriot cause seemed on the verge of complete collapse. The British had fundamentally shifted their military strategy, giving up attempts to control the northern colonies where Patriot resistance remained fierce, and instead focusing their efforts on conquering the southern colonies, where they believed loyalist sentiment was stronger. They had captured Savannah, Georgia in December 1778 after a brief siege, giving them control of Georgia's colonial capital. In May 1780, they achieved an even more devastating victory when they captured Charleston, South Carolina, after a long siege, forcing the surrender of over 5,000 Continental Army soldiers, the worst American defeat of the entire war. The main American army in the South was effectively destroyed in this single disaster. In August 1780, attempting to rebuild American resistance, General Horatio Gates led another army south to confront the British, only to be completely destroyed at the Battle of Camden, where British forces under Lord Cornwallis routed the Americans, killing or capturing thousands more soldiers. The Patriot cause in the southern colonies seemed utterly, completely finished. British forces controlled every major city and port. Patriot armies had been repeatedly crushed. An organized resistance appeared impossible, but the British made a crucial miscalculation, an error in judgment that would ultimately cost them control of the South and perhaps the entire war. They believed that most Southerners were actually loyal to the Crown and would support British rule once the small minority of Patriot leadership was defeated and Patriot armies were destroyed. To control the countryside and maintain order, they organized loyalist militias made up of Americans who supported the Crown, giving these forces authority to calm resistant areas and punish patriots who continued opposing British rule. One of these loyalist commanders was Major Patrick Ferguson, a Scottish officer who was both highly skilled as a military leader and remarkably brutal in his treatment of rebels. Ferguson was appointed as Inspector of Militia for the British Southern Army and given command of loyalist forces tasked with controlling the Carolina backcountry. In September 1780, as he moved through the region with his loyalist militia, he issued a proclamation to the frontier settlements across the Appalachian Mountains, the Overmountain settlements where Isaac Shelby and other frontier leaders lived. Ferguson's message was blunt and threatening. The frontier settlers must stop supporting the Patriot cause, stop all resistance to British authority, and submit to Crown rule. If they refused, Ferguson promised he would personally march his army across the mountains, hang their leaders as traitors, and lay waste to their entire country with fire and sword, destroying everything they had built. This threat was quite possibly the worst strategic mistake Ferguson could have made, revealing a fundamental misunderstanding of frontier character and culture. The Overmountain Men, as the frontier settlers were collectively called, were fiercely, almost pathologically independent. They had fought for years against enormous odds to build their communities in hostile wilderness. They had survived Native American raids, food shortages, disease outbreaks, and isolation from any external support. They had created their own governmental structures when official authority failed to reach them. They weren't going to be threatened or intimidated by anyone, regardless of whether that person was a British officer, a loyalist militia commander, or anyone else. When Ferguson's arrogant proclamation reached Isaac Shelby in mid-September 1780, his response was immediate, decisive, and would change American history. He would raise every fighting man he could from the frontier settlements and march east to confront Ferguson before the British officer could carry out his threats. If Ferguson wanted war with the frontier, he would get more war than he could possibly handle. Isaac immediately rode to meet with John Sevier, another prominent frontier leader from the Washington County area who had his own substantial following. Sevier was a fellow frontiersman, a proven fighter with extensive combat experience, and someone Isaac trusted completely based on years of working together in various frontier conflicts. The two men made their plans with remarkable speed and decisiveness. They would issue calls throughout the frontier settlements for militia to assemble, spread the word through the extensive network of frontier families and communities, and gather at Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River, a location that could accommodate a large force and had symbolic significance as a center of frontier self-government. From there, they would march east across the mountain ranges to find Ferguson and his loyalist forces. They were going hunting, and their prey was a British officer who had foolishly challenged them on their own ground in their own element, where they held every possible advantage. The call went out through the frontier communities via a network of messengers riding from settlement to settlement, and the response was extraordinary. Men throughout the region grabbed their personal rifles, said goodbye to wives and children who understood the stakes, and assembled for what would become an epic military campaign. These weren't soldiers in any formal sense of the word. They had no uniforms or standardized equipment, no military training beyond practical frontier experience gained through years of survival, no formal chain of command beyond the natural authority of respected leaders, but they were some of the most effective fighters in North America, possibly in the entire world at that moment. They could shoot accurately at ranges that amazed European observers, hitting man-sized targets at distances of 200 yards or more. They could move quickly through difficult terrain that would slow conventional armies to a crawl. They understood woodland warfare instinctively, knowing how to use cover, how to move silently, how to ambush and withdraw, and they were motivated by direct personal stakes in the outcome. Their homes, their families, their entire way of life were at risk. This wasn't an abstract political ideology or distant loyalty to a government. This was immediate, personal, and absolutely vital to their survival. On September 25, 1780, approximately 900 men gathered at Sycamore Shoals, creating a scene that witnesses described in letters and journals with awe. These were hard men from hard country, each carrying his personal long rifle that he had used for years, knew intimately, and could shoot with remarkable accuracy. They carried powder horns for gunpowder, shot pouches with ammunition, hunting knives for close combat and general utility, and minimal other equipment. They had brought limited supplies, expecting to live off the land as they marched, hunting game for food and sleeping outdoors, regardless of weather. This was how frontier militia always operated, traveling light and fast, unburdened by the extensive supply trains that slowed conventional armies. Isaac Shelby was commanding men from Sullivan County, individuals who had followed him in previous conflicts and trusted him completely. John Sevier commanded Washington County men who were equally loyal to him. Colonel William Campbell had brought Virginia militia from the Washington County, Virginia area. Charles McDowell led Burke County forces from North Carolina. Benjamin Cleveland commanded Wilkes County men. The list continued, a remarkable gathering of frontier leaders who understood they had to act decisively now or lose everything they had worked for. Before they departed on their dangerous mission, a Presbyterian minister named Samuel Doak preached a sermon that became famous in frontier history and is still remembered today. Doak invoked the biblical story of Gideon, comparing the frontier militia to Gideon's small force facing overwhelming enemies, but achieving victory through faith and courage. He prayed passionately for divine assistance in their upcoming battle, asking God to protect these men who were fighting to defend their families and their freedom. He concluded with words that became the militia's battle cry, words they would shout as they attacked the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. The men roared their approval, their voices echoing off the surrounding mountains. They weren't a professional army with formal discipline and training, but they had something perhaps more powerful: absolute faith in their cause, complete trust in their leaders, and the determination to see this through no matter what it cost them personally. The march across the mountains began immediately after this religious service, and it would prove to be an extraordinary feat of endurance and determination. They crossed through gaps in the Appalachian range, following trails that were barely more than narrow paths through dense forest, sometimes scrambling over rocky terrain where horses had to be led rather than ridden. It was late September, and the weather at high altitude was already turning cold, especially at night when temperatures dropped dramatically. The men pushed forward relentlessly despite these hardships, understanding that speed was absolutely essential to their mission success. If Ferguson learned they were coming, he might retreat to the main British army under Lord Cornwallis, where he would be protected by thousands of regular British troops and become impossible to catch. They had to find him while he was still isolated with only his loyalist militia, vulnerable to attack by a determined frontier force. As they marched east, descending from the mountains into the Carolina Piedmont, their numbers continued to grow steadily. More militia units joined them from various regions. Other frontier leaders brought their men into the growing force, swelling its size and power. By the time they had fully descended the eastern slopes of the mountains, they had well over 1,000 fighters, a formidable force by the standards of irregular warfare. But they also had a significant organizational problem that required resolution. who was actually in command. All the colonels leading various militia units were roughly equal in authority, representing different regions and communities. There was no clear overall commander, and military operations absolutely require unified decision-making, someone who can issue orders that everyone will follow. The colonels met repeatedly to discuss this problem and agreed on a practical solution. Colonel William Campbell of Virginia would serve as officer of the day, essentially the operational commander who would direct movements and coordinate the attack. However, major strategic decisions would still be made collectively by a council of colonels. It was an imperfect solution that could have led to disaster if the colonels disagreed at crucial moments. But it would have to work because they had no better alternative given the political realities of commanding militia from multiple jurisdictions. As they moved through the Carolina backcountry, traveling east toward where they believed Ferguson was operating, they actively gathered intelligence about his location and movements. Local Patriot families provided crucial information about Ferguson's recent activities, where he had camped, which direction he was traveling, how many men he had. The intelligence painted an increasingly clear picture. Ferguson was moving through the area with approximately 1,000 loyalist militia, conducting what we would today call counterinsurgency operations. He was burning Patriot farms to punish families who supported independence, intimidating the local population into submission through displays of military force, and trying to establish British control over the white country. But Ferguson had also learned that a large rebel force was coming after him, hunting him specifically. Rather than standing his ground or seeking battle, he started moving south and east toward the main British army to seek protection from Cornwallis's regular forces. The race was now on. Could the Overmountain Men catch Ferguson before he reached the safety of the main British army? If he escaped, their entire campaign would be for nothing, and Ferguson would remain free to carry out his threats against their settlements. On the night of October 6, 1780, the Patriot force received crucial intelligence that would determine everything that followed. Ferguson had stopped at a place called King's Mountain, a rocky ridge on the border between North Carolina and South Carolina. He had chosen this position specifically because he believed it was highly defensible and would protect his force until British reinforcements could arrive. The ridge was about 600 yards long and rose about 60 feet above the surrounding terrain, with relatively steep slopes covered in trees and rocks. Ferguson was confident that this position gave him enormous tactical advantages. Rebels would have to attack uphill, always difficult in any military operation, and would be exposed to defensive fire as they advanced. He sent a message to Lord Cornwallis, claiming that he was on King's Mountain, that he was king of that mountain, and that God Almighty himself could not drive him from it. This was classic Ferguson, supremely confident to the point of arrogance, absolutely convinced of his military superiority over what he viewed as undisciplined frontier rabble. The Patriot colonels meeting in council immediately decided to strike without delay. They couldn't afford to wait or hesitate. They selected their best fighters, approximately 900 men, who had the best horses and the freshest supplies, and made a forced night march toward King's Mountain. They rode through rain and darkness, covering over 30 miles in approximately 12 hours, an extraordinary achievement that exhausted both men and horses. Many of these fighters had been marching and fighting for nearly 2 weeks with minimal rest, eating whatever they could hunt or find, sleeping on the ground in all weather. They were exhausted, hungry, and cold, but they also understood with perfect clarity that this was their opportunity, perhaps their only opportunity. If they didn't attack now, immediately, Ferguson would escape, and they would have marched across the mountains for nothing. Isaac Shelby rode with his men through that miserable night, constantly moving up and down his column to keep spirits up, checking that everyone stayed together and no one fell too far behind or got separated in the darkness. As a commander, his job during this night march was to ensure his unit remained together and ready to fight. Immediately upon arrival, despite the brutal conditions, he couldn't show doubt or fatigue to his men. They looked to him for confidence and direction, for reassurance that what they were doing made sense and would succeed. This was leadership at its most fundamental level. Not grand speeches or brilliant strategic insights, but simply being present, being steady, being the rock that others could rely on when everything was difficult and uncertain. Isaac's physical presence, his calmness, and his obvious determination pushed his men forward when their bodies wanted to collapse and sleep. They reached the immediate vicinity of Kings Mountain around noon on October 7th, 1780. After riding all night without significant rest, the colonels quickly scouted the position, examining it from multiple angles to understand the terrain and Ferguson's positions. What they saw confirmed their intelligence. Ferguson's loyalist forces, approximately 1,000 men, were positioned on top of the ridge. There were no significant fortifications, no trenches or defensive works, just men gathered on relatively open high ground. The slopes of the ridge were covered in trees that would provide cover for attacking forces. The colonels came up with their plan with remarkable speed, and it was beautifully simple in concept. They would completely surround the mountain, attacking from all sides at the same time. Ferguson would have nowhere to retreat, no way to escape. The long rifles carried by the frontier militia were effective at long range, giving them firepower advantages at distance. The wooded slopes would provide cover as they advanced up the mountain, allowing them to move from tree to tree, firing at the loyalists at the top while minimizing their own exposure. They would systematically tighten the noose until Ferguson had no room left to maneuver and was forced to surrender or be destroyed. The colonels divided their force into several assault columns, each assigned to attack a different section of the ridge. Isaac Shelby would command one of these columns, leading his Sullivan County men up the southwestern slope of the ridge. John Sevier would attack nearby with his Washington County forces. William Campbell would lead a major assault on the northeastern end of the ridge. Other colonels, including Cleveland, Chronicle, Williams, and others would fill in the surrounding positions, creating a complete encirclement. Once everyone was in position surrounding the ridge, the attack would begin without any further signal or coordination. Each unit would simply start advancing when they were ready, trusting that other units would also be attacking at the same time and that the combined pressure from all directions would overwhelm Ferguson's defense. The approach march took approximately an hour as the various columns moved through the forest as quietly as possible, spreading out to surround the ridge completely. The men moved carefully, trying not to alert Ferguson's sentries too early. They checked their rifles, made sure powder was dry despite the previous night's rain, and mentally prepared themselves for what was coming. These weren't professional soldiers who had trained extensively for combat. Most of them had never participated in a formal battle before, but they were hunters, every single one of them. They knew how to stalk prey, how to move through forests quietly, how to judge distances and shoot accurately. They were taking those hunting skills and applying them to warfare, fighting the way they knew how, rather than trying to copy European military tactics that meant nothing in this terrain. Ferguson's sentries didn't detect the approaching Patriot forces until they were very close, within a few hundred yards. When the sentries finally spotted the rebels and fired warning shots, the Battle of Kings Mountain began instantly. All around the ridge, from every direction at the same time, Patriot militia started advancing uphill, moving from tree to tree, just as they had planned, firing at the loyalist positions above them. The sound was instantly overwhelming. It must have been terrifying for both sides. Hundreds of rifles firing created a continuous roar, men shouting orders and battle cries, the wounded beginning to scream almost immediately. Smoke from black powder weapons filled the forest within minutes, making visibility terrible and creating an eerie, hellish atmosphere. The loyalists at the top of the ridge fired down at the advancing Patriots, hitting some but missing many others as the rebels used every bit of available cover, making themselves difficult targets. Isaac Shelby led his men forward into this chaos, directly into the face of enemy fire. He moved from position to position along his line, encouraging his men, pointing out targets, directing their advance. The experience of leading men in combat is difficult to describe to people who haven't experienced it. There's the obvious physical danger of being shot at, which requires enormous courage to face. But there's also the psychological burden of responsibility. Isaac knew that his decisions, his orders, would determine whether his men lived or died. If he made mistakes, good men who trusted him would be killed. That weight of responsibility, combined with the physical danger and the sensory overload of battle, requires a special kind of strength. Isaac showed that strength on the slopes of King's Mountain, never wavering, never showing fear or doubt, being exactly what his men needed him to be. Ferguson responded to the Patriot attack with the tactics he knew best, tactics that had worked for him in previous battles. He organized bayonet charges down the slope, trying to drive the rebels back through aggressive offensive action. His loyalist militia fixed bayonets to their muskets and charged down the hill with fierce determination and considerable courage. The Patriot militia, most of whom had no bayonets at all, only their rifles and hunting knives, fell back before these charges as any sensible force would, fighting bayonet-equipped troops at close quarters. When you have no bayonets, yourself is suicidal, so the Patriots retreated down the slope as the Loyalists charged, giving ground temporarily. From Ferguson's perspective, at the top of the ridge, this looked like his defensive strategy was working. His forces were driving the rebels back with each charge. But this appearance was completely wrong. Each time the Loyalists charged down one side of the ridge, Patriot forces on the opposite side advanced farther up because there were no defenders shooting at them from above. And when the Loyalists withdrew back to the top of the ridge to defend against attacks from other directions, the Patriots they had just driven back would immediately advance again, reoccupying positions they had temporarily abandoned and pushing even farther up the slope. Ferguson was being pulled in multiple directions at the same time, unable to concentrate his force effectively because threats were coming from every direction at once. His interior lines, which should have been an advantage, allowing him to shift forces quickly to threaten points, were actually a trap. He couldn't defend everywhere at once, and every time he reinforced one sector, another sector was left vulnerable. Isaac Shelby recognized this pattern developing and pressed his advantage ruthlessly. Each time the Loyalists charged toward another part of the ridge, he urged his men forward aggressively. They would advance quickly while the enemy was distracted and engaged elsewhere, find new positions closer to the top, and fire into the increasingly compressed Loyalist formation. The rifle fire from the Patriots was absolutely devastating in its effectiveness. Long rifles in the hands of skilled marksmen were deadly accurate at ranges where muskets were nearly useless. Loyalist officers fell constantly shot by marksmen who specifically targeted anyone who looked like a leader or who was giving orders. Soldiers trying to reload their weapons were picked off by shooters who could hit individual targets with remarkable consistency. The Loyalist militia, as brave as they undeniably were, started to waver as casualties mounted rapidly in their tactical position, became increasingly hopeless. They were trapped on top of a ridge, taking accurate fire from all directions, with no possibility of retreat or reinforcement, and watching their comrades fall around them. Ferguson himself was everywhere on the ridge throughout the battle, riding his horse back and forth across the top, rallying his men with shouts and personal example, directing charges toward the most threatened points, refusing to even consider the possibility of surrender. He wore a checked hunting shirt over his uniform, making him easily identifiable to his own troops, but also marking him clearly for enemy shooters. He fought with desperate courage and remarkable tactical skill, doing everything a commander could possibly do to salvage an increasingly hopeless situation. But courage and skill weren't enough to overcome the fundamental tactical realities. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and under devastating fire from hidden positions on all sides. His men were falling steadily. His defensive perimeter was shrinking with each passing minute, and there was no possibility of relief or escape. After approximately 1 hour of intense combat, with the battle reaching its climax and the Loyalist position becoming completely hopeless, Patrick Ferguson was shot. A Patriot bullet struck him, then another, hitting him multiple times, almost at the same time as various shooters fired at the most prominent target on the ridge. He fell from his horse, mortally wounded, probably dead, before he hit the ground. Command of the Loyalist force fell immediately to subordinate officers who recognized instantly the hopelessness of their situation. White flags went up from multiple positions on the ridge. The Loyalists were attempting to surrender, trying to end the killing before everyone was dead. But the battle didn't stop immediately, the way battles are supposed to stop when one side surrenders. Some Patriot fighters, their blood up from an hour of intense combat, their memories fresh with recent atrocities committed by Loyalist forces against Patriot families, continued firing even as white flags appeared. The killing continued for several more minutes, with unarmed or surrendering Loyalists being shot down. Officers, including Isaac Shelby, had to ride among the men physically, shouting orders to cease fire, literally pushing rifle barrels down, forcing their troops to honor the surrender and stop the slaughter. Isaac himself rode through his sector of the battlefield, grabbing men by the shoulders, yelling at them to stop shooting, reminding them that continuing to kill surrendering enemies would make them no better than the worst Loyalist atrocities they were fighting against. When the shooting finally completely stopped, the carnage was evident and shocking even to men accustomed to frontier violence. The Loyalist force had been utterly destroyed. More than 200 Loyalists were dead, including Ferguson, whose body lay on the ridge where he had fallen. Another 150 were wounded, many severely with injuries that would prove fatal in the following days given the limited medical care available. The rest were prisoners. Almost 600 men who would need to be guarded and managed despite the Patriot force having minimal resources for such a task. Patriot casualties were remarkably light by comparison, fewer than 30 killed and around 60 wounded. It was one of the most lopsided victories in the entire war, achieved through superior tactics, better weapons for this particular terrain, more effective use of cover and concealment, and the overwhelming motivation of men fighting to defend their homes and families from direct threats. Isaac Shelby moved through the aftermath of the battle, checking on his own men first to assess casualties and ensure the wounded received whatever medical attention was available. He helped organize the collection of weapons and supplies from the battlefield, knowing these captured arms would be valuable for future militia operations. He took stock of what they had accomplished, both in immediate military terms and in broader strategic implications. He had personally led his column up that mountain under heavy fire, and seen men around him fall wounded or dead, had fired his own weapon at enemy soldiers, and had helped bring about a decisive victory that would echo far beyond this single ridge. But there was absolutely no time for celebration or self-congratulation. The prisoners had to be guarded carefully to prevent escape or further violence against them. The wounded from both sides needed medical attention, though resources for providing care were extremely limited. Most urgently, the Patriot force had to withdraw from the area quickly before British regular forces could arrive to seek revenge and potentially trap the militia force. The Battle of Kings Mountain had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military result, rippling through the entire southern theater of the war, and ultimately affecting the revolution's outcome. News of the victory spread rapidly throughout the southern colonies, carried by messengers and travelers, electrifying Patriot resistance everywhere. Ordinary Americans who had been demoralized by the disasters at Charleston and Camden, who had been told that resistance was futile and British victory inevitable, suddenly learned that militia forces could defeat British line troops in open battle. The carefully cultivated myth of British military invincibility was shattered decisively. If 1,000 frontier militiamen could destroy Ferguson's entire force, then perhaps the war wasn't over after all. Perhaps continued resistance was possible. Perhaps independence was still achievable. The psychological impact of Kings Mountain on both sides cannot be overstated. Lord Cornwallis, who had been advancing north through North Carolina with the main British army, stopped his campaign immediately upon learning of Ferguson's destruction. He couldn't risk operating deep in hostile territory when frontier militia forces could appear suddenly from across the mountains and destroy his detached units. He withdrew his army back into South Carolina to consolidate his position and rethink his strategy. This gave Patriot forces crucial time to regroup, recruit new soldiers, and organize more effective resistance. The momentum in the Southern theater shifted dramatically. British commanders who had been planning offensive operations became defensive and cautious. Patriot leaders who had been thinking about surrender or exile began planning new campaigns. Kings Mountain changed the entire strategic situation in the South, transforming what had seemed like inevitable British victory into a contested struggle that would ultimately end in American success. For Isaac Shelby personally, the battle at Kings Mountain established his reputation permanently as a military leader of the highest caliber. He had helped organize the campaign from its beginning, had led men effectively through difficult marches and brutal combat, had shown personal courage under fire that inspired others, and had exercised judgment and restraint in victory by stopping the killing of surrendering enemies. He was 30 years old and had proven himself in the crucible of battle in ways that left no doubt about his capabilities. His name became known throughout the frontier regions and far beyond. When people discussed the victory at Kings Mountain, Isaac Shelby's name was always mentioned prominently among the heroes. People wanted this man leading them, fighting for them, representing their interests. He had shown all the qualities that frontier communities valued most: courage, competence, fairness, and commitment to the common cause over personal glory. But the war was far from over, and Isaac's service continued without pause. After Kings Mountain in October 1780, he participated in numerous other campaigns throughout the Carolinas during 1781. The Southern theater of the war had become a brutal, complex conflict featuring irregular warfare, raids, ambushes, and atrocities committed by both sides against civilian populations. Traditional battle lines barely existed. Loyalist and Patriot militias hunted each other through the backcountry, burning farms, destroying crops, and executing prisoners. British regular forces tried to maintain control of strategic locations, while Patriot guerrilla fighters constantly harassed their supply lines and communications. It was exhausting, demoralizing warfare that ground down everyone involved, soldiers and civilians alike. Isaac served as a militia colonel in several significant battles during this period, always commanding frontier troops, always adapting tactics to specific circumstances rather than following rigid European military doctrines. He fought at the Battle of Cowpens in January 1781, one of the most tactically brilliant American victories of the entire war. At Cowpens, American commander Daniel Morgan used militia forces brilliantly, incorporating their strengths and weaknesses into a tactical plan that destroyed a British force under Colonel Banastre Tarleton. Isaac's militia units played their assigned role perfectly, fighting effectively and then withdrawing in good order as planned, allowing Continental regular troops to deliver the decisive blow. The victory at Cowpens, combined with Kings Mountain, showed conclusively that American forces could defeat British regulars in open battle when properly led and tactically deployed. Throughout 1781, Isaac participated in various smaller actions, raids, and skirmishes that don't appear in most history books, but were absolutely vital to maintaining Patriot resistance in the South. He led expeditions to protect supply convoys carrying food and ammunition to Patriot forces. He organized defensive operations to protect settlements from Loyalist raids. He participated in attacks on British outposts and supply depots. This was unglamorous, exhausting work that received little recognition, but was essential to keeping the Patriot cause alive during the critical final years of the war. By late 1781, the strategic situation had shifted decisively in favor of American independence. Lord Cornwallis had moved his army to Virginia, attempting to open a new theater of operations and to coordinate with British forces operating from New York, but American and French forces working in unprecedented coordination had trapped Cornwallis on the Yorktown Peninsula. The British army was surrounded by land and blockaded by sea, with no possibility of escape or reinforcement. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army to George Washington and the French commander Rochambeau. This surrender effectively ended major combat operations in North America, though the war wouldn't officially end until the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. Isaac Shelby could finally return home to his family and his land, having given years of his life to the Patriot cause at considerable personal cost. After the war finally ended, Isaac faced the universal challenge that all returning veterans face: rebuilding civilian life after years of military service. He had a wife, Susanna Hart, whom he had married in 1783, a woman described by people who knew her as intelligent, capable, and perfectly suited to frontier life. He had land claims in various frontier regions, property rights he had earned through surveying work and military service. He had ambitions to be more than just a farmer or surveyor, to play a significant role in shaping the new nation that was emerging from the war. But first, he had to establish himself economically and secure his family's future. The years of military service had completely disrupted his civilian career and financial situation. He needed to rebuild his fortune from essentially nothing and create a stable foundation for his family. Isaac turned his attention decisively westward to Kentucky, the region he had surveyed years earlier and had always believed represented the future of American expansion. This territory was being rapidly settled in the years immediately following the Revolution by thousands of families seeking opportunity in land. The old British prohibitions on settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains were completely gone, swept away by American victory. Land was available in quantities that Eastern settlers could barely imagine, and Isaac had both connections and reputation that would serve him exceptionally well in this new territory. In 1783, he moved his family across the mountains to Kentucky, settling initially in Lincoln County in the central part of the territory. He established a large farm with hundreds of acres, engaged in various business ventures, including land speculation and trading, and quickly became one of the most prominent and respected men in the rapidly growing region Kentucky in the 1780s. However, was still a genuinely dangerous frontier despite increasing settlement. Native American nations, including the Shawnee, Miami, Cherokee, and others, were fighting desperately to defend their ancestral lands from the flood of American settlers pouring across the mountains. These nations had every reason to resist. The land that Americans were settling had been indigenous territory for centuries. Treaties that supposedly protected Native American lands were being violated constantly by settlers who believed they had a right to claim any land they could occupy. The result was a brutal, ongoing conflict characterized by raids and counter-raids with atrocities committed by both sides. Frontier settlements were attacked, families killed or captured, crops and homes destroyed. In response, American militia forces launched expeditions against Native American villages, destroying homes, crops, and food supplies, killing warriors, and sometimes civilians. It was a vicious cycle of violence with deep roots in competing visions for the future of the continent. Isaac Shelby, given his military reputation and proven leadership abilities, was frequently called upon to lead militia forces in these frontier conflicts. He served in several campaigns against Native American villages during the 1780s. A morally complicated and troubling aspect of his career that requires honest acknowledgement. From the settlers' perspective, they were defending their homes and families from violent attacks, responding to real threats with necessary force. From the Native American perspective, they were defending their homeland from invasion, fighting to preserve their way of life against an unstoppable tide of settlers who would not stop coming. These conflicts had no easy moral resolution. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides suffered terribly. Both sides believed they were fighting for survival. Isaac participated in this violence as a militia commander, leading expeditions that destroyed Native American villages and food supplies, actions that contributed to the eventual displacement of indigenous peoples from Kentucky. This history cannot be ignored or minimized. It was part of the brutal reality of frontier expansion. Understanding Isaac Shelby's complete legacy requires acknowledging these difficult truths alongside his achievements. As Kentucky's population grew rapidly throughout the late 1780s, reaching tens of thousands of settlers by the end of the decade, the question of government became increasingly pressing and politically heated. Kentucky was originally part of Virginia, attached to that state through colonial charters and tradition, but it was separated from Virginia by the Appalachian Mountains and hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. Communication with Virginia's government was slow and unreliable. Virginia's political leaders focused on issues relevant to eastern population centers, often seemed indifferent to Kentucky's unique challenges and needs. Kentuckians increasingly believed they needed their own state government, their own representation in Congress, their own ability to make decisions about their future without waiting for approval from distant authorities who didn't understand or prioritize their concerns. This desire for statehood was nearly universal among Kentucky settlers, though there were debates about the specific form their government should take and the relationship it should maintain with the federal government. Multiple conventions were held throughout the late 1780s and early 1790s to debate Kentucky statehood and draft constitutional frameworks. These were remarkable exercises in democratic self-government, where ordinary citizens and their elected representatives gathered to literally create a new state from scratch. Isaac Shelby participated actively in these conventions, lending his enormous prestige and practical experience to the discussions. He argued consistently for statehood, saying that Kentucky had earned the right to self-government through the sacrifices its people had made during the Revolution and the subsequent years of frontier defense. He helped draft constitutional provisions, debated specific governmental structures, and worked to build agreement among diverse factions within Kentucky's growing population. His involvement in these conventions showed his evolution from purely military leadership to comprehensive civic leadership, from fighting for independence to building the governmental institutions that independence made possible. In 1792, after years of negotiation between Kentucky representatives and the Virginia legislature with approval from Congress, Kentucky was formally admitted to the Union as the 15th state. It was a momentous occasion, the first state created west of the Appalachian Mountains, proof that American expansion and self-government could successfully extend beyond the original 13 colonies. The new state needed a governor immediately, someone who could provide leadership during the critical initial period when governmental structures were being established and legitimized. Isaac Shelby was the overwhelming favorite for this position, supported by virtually all factions within Kentucky's diverse political landscape. His military record, particularly his role at Kings Mountain, was legendary. His leadership experience in various capacities was extensive and proven. His fairness in dealing with people and resolving disputes was widely acknowledged. His frontier credentials were impeccable, establishing him as a genuine man of the people rather than an aristocratic elite. He was the ideal choice, possibly the only choice that could unite Kentucky's population behind the new government. In June 1792, Isaac Shelby became the first governor of Kentucky, taking office without significant opposition. He was 41 years old, at the height of his powers and abilities, and he was taking on perhaps the most challenging administrative task imaginable, building an entire state government from essentially nothing. Kentucky had no established bureaucracy to carry out governmental functions. It had no clear tax system to fund operations. It had no organized militia structure despite constant military threats. It had no functioning court system to resolve disputes and administer justice. Everything had to be created from the ground up, established firmly enough to function effectively, but flexibly enough to adapt as circumstances changed. Isaac worked closely with the newly elected legislature to establish these basic governmental functions, drafting legislation, appointing officials, creating administrative procedures, and generally building the machinery of state government day by day. As governor, Isaac faced enormous challenges that tested his abilities in ways different from but equally demanding as a military command. He strongly supported education, believing that an informed citizenry was essential for democratic government to work successfully. He pushed for the creation of public schools and for the establishment of what would eventually become Transylvania University, one of the first institutions of higher learning west of the Appalachians. He advocated for infrastructure development, particularly roads that would connect scattered settlements and help commerce. He worked to establish organized defense through a properly structured state militia that could respond quickly to threats without requiring every able-bodied man to drop his work constantly. He tried to balance the needs and interests of different regions within the state, from the established settlements around Lexington and Louisville to the raw frontier areas further west, where settlement was just beginning. He managed Kentucky's relationship with the federal government, which was itself still figuring out how federalism would work in practice and what the relationship between state and federal authority should look like. One of the most controversial and difficult issues Isaac faced as governor involved the Spanish Empire and the Mississippi River. Spain controlled the territory west of the Mississippi River, including the strategically and economically crucial port of New Orleans at the river's mouth, Kentucky. Farmers depended absolutely on shipping their agricultural products down the Mississippi River to New Orleans for export to Atlantic markets. Without access to this river route, Kentucky's entire economy would collapse because there was no practical alternative for getting bulk agricultural goods to market over the Appalachian Mountains. But Spain, viewing American expansion with deep suspicion and wanting to limit American power, periodically closed the Mississippi River to American commerce, effectively strangling Kentucky's economy and causing severe hardship for farming families who depended on export income. Some Kentuckians, increasingly frustrated with the federal government's apparent inability or unwillingness to resolve this crisis, began scheming with Spanish officials about possibly separating Kentucky from the United States and aligning it with Spanish interests. These separatist plots, while never involving large numbers of people, were genuinely dangerous to national unity and represented a real threat to the young nation's survival. Isaac had to navigate these dangerous political waters with extreme care, working to suppress separatist movements and maintain Kentucky's loyalty to the United States, while simultaneously pressuring the federal government to defend Kentucky's economic interests more effectively. He had to balance competing demands from different constituencies, manage relationships with federal officials who sometimes seemed indifferent to Western concerns, and maintain political stability in Kentucky despite severe economic pressures. It required all of his diplomatic skills and political judgment, showing that governing could be as challenging as fighting. Isaac served as Kentucky's first governor from 1792 to 1796, 4 years of exhausting work, building state government, and managing countless challenges. Kentucky law at the time prohibited governors from serving consecutive terms based on Republican theory that concentrated executive power was dangerous and that regular rotation of leadership was healthy for democracy. So in 1796, when his term ended, Isaac retired from office despite remaining popular and effective. He returned to private life at age 45, focusing on his large farm, engaging in various business ventures, and enjoying his growing family. He and Susanna ultimately had 11 children together. A large family, even by frontier standards where big families were common. He was building a personal dynasty, establishing the Shelby name as one of Kentucky's founding families with connections throughout the state's political and economic elite. Isaac could reasonably have believed his public service was finished after leaving the governorship. He had fought in the Revolution, had built a state government from nothing, had served honorably and effectively. He had earned the right to enjoy private life, to focus on his family and personal interests, to let younger men take on the burdens of leadership. He spent the next 16 years doing exactly that, managing his substantial agricultural and business interests, watching his children grow and marry, and gradually becoming an elder statesman whose advice was sought, but who held no official position. He seemed content with this arrangement, enjoying the prosperity and stability he had worked so hard to achieve. But in 1812, the United States went to war with Great Britain for the second time in a generation. And the nation once again called on Isaac Shelby to serve. The War of 1812 was a complicated conflict with multiple causes and motivations on both sides. Americans were angry about British interference with American shipping, particularly the Royal Navy's practice of stopping American merchant ships and impressing sailors they claimed were British subjects. Americans were frustrated by British support for Native American confederacies that were resisting American expansion in the Northwest Territory, believing that British weapons and encouragement were prolonging conflicts that would otherwise have ended. Some Americans, particularly Western expansionists, saw the war as an opportunity to conquer British Canada and eliminate British influence in North America entirely. For Britain, fighting America was a distraction from the far more important war against Napoleonic France. But British pride and imperial interests demanded a response to American provocations. Kentucky was heavily involved in this war from its beginning, because the Western theater focused significantly on conflicts with Native American confederacies allied with Britain. The great Shawnee leader Tecumseh had organized a remarkable pan-indigenous alliance, attempting to create a unified Native American state that could resist American expansion through military force and political coordination. Tecumseh's Confederacy, supplied and supported by British forces in Canada, represented a serious threat to American settlements. Throughout the Northwest, the federal government needed strong leadership in Western states to organize military forces and coordinate campaigns against both Native American forces and British troops operating from Canada. Kentucky needed a governor who could organize the state's militia forces effectively, work with federal commanders, and maintain public support for a war that was immediately unpopular in some regions. Isaac Shelby, now 61 years old, was drafted back into service by popular demand. The Kentucky legislature formally requested that he run for governor again. Prominent citizens throughout the state begged him to return to office. The state constitution had been amended to allow non-consecutive terms, so it was now legal for him to serve again after his 16-year absence from office. Isaac could have refused. He was an old man by the standards of the early 19th century. He had already given decades of service to his state and nation. He had earned comfortable retirement, but duty called again, and Isaac Shelby had never refused his duty. He agreed to run for governor, more from sense of obligation than personal ambition. He was elected overwhelmingly in 1812, 16 years after leaving office, called back to service in his state's moment of need. As governor during the War of 1812, Isaac worked tirelessly to organize Kentucky's military contributions to the war effort. He coordinated with federal commanders, including General William Henry Harrison, who was leading American forces in the Northwest, He worked to supply and equip militia forces with weapons, ammunition, food, and transportation. He dealt with the enormous logistical challenges of moving thousands of militia soldiers to distant battlefields and keeping them supplied once they arrived. He managed political pressures from citizens who supported the war and from those who opposed it. He maintained his own physical strength and mental sharpness despite his age, refusing to let advancing years limit his effectiveness. And then, in 1813, at the age of 62, Isaac Shelby did something truly remarkable that showed his continued vitality and commitment to leadership by example. He personally led Kentucky militia forces on a military campaign, joining General William Henry Harrison's army in an invasion of Canada. This wasn't symbolic leadership from a safe distance. Isaac actually accompanied his troops into the field, riding with them, enduring the same hardships they faced, sharing their dangers. For a 62-year-old governor to personally lead troops in combat was almost unprecedented. But Isaac believed his presence was necessary to inspire the militia and to coordinate operations effectively. The Kentucky Mounted Volunteers he commanded were a formidable force, experienced frontiersmen and farmers who could ride hard and fight effectively. But they needed leadership they trusted absolutely. Isaac provided that leadership through his physical presence and personal example. The climactic battle of this campaign came at the Thames River in Ontario, Canada, in October 1813, more than 33 years after Isaac had fought at Kings Mountain. American forces under Harrison and Shelby encountered a combined British and Native American army that had been retreating through Canada. The British force under General Henry Proctor had been coordinating with Tecumseh's Confederacy to resist American invasion at the Thames River. The retreating forces decided to make a stand and a significant battle developed. Isaac Shelby, despite his age, personally commanded the Kentucky Mounted Volunteers during their crucial charge that helped break the British defensive line. His leadership in this battle, his willingness to personally face danger at an age when most men would have been content to observe from safety, inspired his troops to extraordinary efforts. The American victory was decisive. The British force was routed and scattered. Most significantly, the great Shawnee leader Tecumseh was killed during the battle, ending his Confederacy's organized resistance. Tecumseh's death removed the most significant indigenous leader opposing American expansion and effectively ended unified Native American resistance in the Northwest. The victory at the Thames River had strategic consequences far beyond the immediate tactical result. It effectively ended serious fighting in the Northwest theater of the war, securing American control of the region and opening it for further settlement. It eliminated the Native American Confederacy, a significant military threat, ending decades of conflict that had consumed enormous resources and caused terrible suffering on all sides. For Isaac Shelby, personally, it was a remarkable capstone to his military career, showing that even at 62 years old, he remained an effective military leader capable of inspiring troops and winning battles. He returned to Kentucky once again as a celebrated hero, having proven that his legendary status was based not just on past glories, but on continued excellence and commitment. Isaac completed his second term as governor in 1816, finally retiring from public office at age 65. He had given most of his adult life to public service in various capacities, from militia captain to state governor, from Revolutionary War hero to War of 1812 veteran. He had participated in some of the most significant military campaigns in American history. He had built a state government from nothing and led it through crises, both domestic and foreign. He had earned beyond any possible dispute the right to rest. He returned to his home in Lincoln County, Kentucky, to his family and his land, to enjoy whatever time remained to him in peace and comfort. Isaac spent his final decade at his substantial estate, surrounded by his large extended family. He managed his agricultural operations with the same attention to detail he had brought to military campaigns and governmental administration. He spent time with his children and grandchildren, passing down stories of the Revolutionary era and frontier days. He occasionally entertained visitors who wanted to meet the legendary frontiersman and war hero, people who traveled considerable distances just to shake his hand and hear him speak. He became a living link to the revolutionary generation, one of the last surviving heroes of Kings Mountain and other famous battles. Young people would visit specifically to hear his first-hand account of fighting the British, of leading the Overmountain Men, of building Kentucky from wilderness. Isaac generally obliged these visitors, sharing his memories while probably downplaying his own role in favor of emphasizing collective efforts and shared sacrifices. Isaac Shelby died on July 18, 1826, at the age of 75. Having lived a remarkably full and consequential life, by remarkable coincidence, his death came less than a month after the deaths of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, both of whom had died on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after they had worked together on the Declaration of Independence. It was as if the entire revolutionary generation was departing together. The last great heroes of independence passing from the scene and making way for the new America they had sacrificed so much to create. Isaac was buried at his estate in Kentucky, in the state he had helped create and led, surrounded by the land and people he had defended throughout his life. His legacy extended far beyond his lifetime, influencing American development in ways both tangible and subtle. He had been a military leader who won genuinely decisive battles, campaigns that changed the strategic situation and affected the revolution's outcome. He had been a state founder who built governmental institutions from literally nothing, creating structures that would govern Kentucky for generations. He had been a public servant who repeatedly answered his country's call, even when comfortable retirement was readily available. He had been a family man who raised 11 children and established a prominent American dynasty. Counties and towns throughout the United States were named in his honor: Shelby County, Kentucky; Shelby County, Tennessee; Shelby County, Alabama; and Shelbyville in multiple states, all commemorated his contributions and kept his memory alive for future generations. But perhaps Isaac Shelby's most important legacy was his powerful example of citizen leadership in a democratic republic. Isaac wasn't a professional politician who made politics his career. He wasn't a career military officer who had attended academies and spent his life in uniform. He was a frontier farmer who stepped up when his community needed him, who led effectively because people trusted him based on his character and proven abilities, and who returned to private life when his service was complete rather than clinging to power. He embodied perfectly the democratic ideal that leadership should come from the people themselves, emerging organically from communities based on merit and trust, rather than from hereditary aristocracy or professional political classes who were separate from ordinary citizens. He proved through his entire life that ordinary Americans, given extraordinary challenges, could rise to meet them and could govern themselves successfully without kings or aristocrats. The story of Isaac Shelby is in many fundamental ways the story of early America itself, reflecting the nation's characters, struggles, and values. It's a story of westward expansion and how that expansion transformed both the land and the people who moved into it. It's a story of frontier democracy and ordinary people creating governments and institutions without royal charters or aristocratic guidance. It's a story of military courage and determination against superior forces. It's also a story that includes violence and displacement, particularly of Native American peoples whose ancestral lands were taken as settlers like Isaac Shelby moved west. This darker aspect of the story cannot be ignored or minimized in an honest assessment. The democracy that Isaac helped build was created partially through the taking away of lands from indigenous nations who had their own claims to the land and their own visions for their future. This moral complexity, this mixture of admirable achievement and troubling costs, is characteristic of American expansion and must be acknowledged when we discuss historical figures like Isaac Shelby. When we remember Isaac Shelby today, we should remember and grapple with the full complexity of his life and the era he lived in. He was unquestionably a product of his time, sharing many of his era's prejudices, limitations, and moral blind spots. The frontier expansion he participated in and helped came at enormous tragic cost to indigenous peoples whose lands were taken, whose ways of life were destroyed, whose very survival was threatened. The democracy he helped build originally and intentionally excluded women, enslaved people, Native Americans, and many others from political participation and full citizenship. These historical realities must be acknowledged honestly and cannot be excused by saying that everyone thought that way at the time. But while acknowledging these serious moral failures, we can also recognize Isaac Shelby's genuine achievements within the historical context. He operated in his remarkable courage at Kings Mountain and other battles, his effective and generally fair leadership as governor, his consistent commitment to public service over personal gain, and his role in building American democratic institutions that would later, through the efforts of excluded groups fighting for inclusion, expand to embrace those originally denied full citizenship. Isaac Shelby's personal journey spanned the entire Revolutionary era and the early Republic period, encompassing some of the most transformative decades in American history. He was born in 1750 when America was simply a collection of British colonies with no concept of independence or national identity. He fought from 1776 to 1781 to create an independent nation against enormous odds. He helped build new states and new governments in the 1780s and 1790s, transforming revolutionary ideals into functioning institutions. He lived to see America beginning to emerge as a continental power that would eventually extend from ocean to ocean. His personal journey from frontier farm boy to war hero to governor to elder statesman closely paralleled America's own journey from colonial status to independent nation to expanding republic. In understanding his life in depth, we understand something essential about how America was actually made on the ground level, about the kinds of people who built it through their daily choices and actions, and about the challenges, contradictions, and moral complexities they faced. The lessons from Isaac Shelby's remarkable life remain relevant for modern Americans, even though the specific circumstances of his era are long past. His example of stepping up to serve when your community needs you, even when it's difficult and costly personally, remains valuable. His model of leading through personal example and earned trust, rather than simply through formal authority or inherited position, remains instructive. His demonstration of maintaining integrity in public service, using power for community benefit rather than personal enrichment, remains exemplary. His ability to balance rightful ambition with genuine concern for others' welfare remains worth studying. His judgment about when to serve in public roles and when to step aside for others remains wise. Modern Americans can learn from how he handled leadership responsibilities, how he inspired others to extraordinary efforts, how he made difficult decisions under extreme pressure, and how he knew when active service was necessary and when retirement was appropriate. When Isaac Shelby rode toward Kings Mountain in October 1780, leading his column of Sullivan County militia through the rain and darkness, he couldn't possibly have imagined everything that would follow from that single decision. He couldn't have known that he would become a governor who would build a state. He couldn't have known he would lead troops in battle again more than 3 decades later as an old man. He couldn't have known he would become a legend whose name would be remembered centuries after his death. He was simply doing what the moment required, leading the men who had placed their trust in him, fighting for the community that depended on his leadership. He was responding to immediate necessity, without grand visions of future glory or historical legacy. Sometimes history's greatest and most influential figures aren't those who deliberately seek greatness or consciously try to shape history's course, but rather those who simply respond to their particular moments with courage, competence, and integrity. Isaac Shelby was exactly that kind of figure. He didn't set out to become a historical legend or a revered founding father of Kentucky. He became those things by consistently doing what he believed was right in difficult circumstances, by earning trust through action rather than words, by proving his worth through service rather than self-promotion, and by never forgetting where he came from or whom he ultimately served. The frontier world that shaped Isaac Shelby's character and values is completely gone now, transformed beyond recognition. The wilderness has been tamed and developed. The conflicts that consumed his generation have been resolved or transformed into entirely different forms. The challenges he faced are not the challenges we face today, but the fundamental qualities he embodied throughout his 75-year life remain valuable and relevant across time. Courage when facing genuine danger and uncertainty, wisdom when making decisions that affect others, integrity when wielding power over fellow citizens, and humility when receiving praise and recognition. These are genuinely timeless virtues that transcend specific historical circumstances. Isaac Shelby demonstrated all of them consistently throughout his remarkable life. From the blood-soaked slopes of Kings Mountain to the formal chambers of the governor's mansion in Frankfort, from the Watauga frontier settlements to the Thames River battlefield in Canada, Isaac Shelby lived a life characterized by service, effective leadership, and authentic meaning. His story absolutely deserves to be remembered, carefully studied, and properly honored by those of us who benefit from the nation and institutions he helped create. Thank you for watching History USA. Isaac Shelby's extraordinary story reminds us powerfully that America was built by real people facing real challenges. People who consciously chose courage over comfort, who valued service over narrow self-interest, and who prioritized community welfare over individual gain. Their enormous sacrifices, their willingness to risk everything for principles they believed in, made our present circumstances possible. Their examples, both their achievements and their failures, can and should guide our future choices. If you found this story meaningful and valuable, please like this video, subscribe to our channel for more content, and share it with others who appreciate American history in all its complexity. We have many more stories to tell about the remarkable individuals who built this nation, the complicated challenges they faced, and the enduring lessons their lives provide for us today. History isn't just about memorizing dates and facts or celebrating heroes uncritically. It's about genuinely understanding the human experiences, choices, and struggles that shaped our world, and recognizing our deep connection to those who came before us, learning both from their achievements and from their failures. Until next time, remember that every generation faces its own unique challenges and must find its own heroes and leaders. The fundamental question is always the same across time. When your particular moment of challenge comes, when your community needs you, when circumstances demand courage and service, will you answer that call? Isaac Shelby answered that call repeatedly throughout his long life, and America is immeasurably better for his service. His example remains available to inspire and guide us if we choose to learn from it.